Alright, I should be live. Good morning, folks. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of Let's Practice Cursive. If this is your first time here, my name is Diego Irigoyen, and what we do is we pull out sheets of paper and we practice our handwriting. And we also tear sheets of paper up. So, yeah. It's okay. This is all live. I can't take anything back. It's forever. Seen by the public. But yes, thank you for joining me today. I tear sheets out of my composition book because I enjoy writing on a flat surface. So I'm pulling sheets of paper out for that now. And since this paper got all torn up and is not a full sheet, I'm just going to go ahead and fool around with that sheet of paper for now to get started. But I was thinking a lot about a very particular topic, and it has to do with penmanship, but it's also related to work. Upcoming work for myself. Okay, I think that's fine. And it has to do with why penmanship is good for the brain, or why penmanship is a worthwhile investment. And I was doing research, and I came across the fact that as we're growing up, we are developing new axons. These are pathways in the brain. We're developing all these new pathways that connect different areas of the brain. And as these pathways are growing, connecting one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. Also, areas of the brain do different things. It's all working in harmony. So when people say, oh, you're only using 10% of your brain, it's pretty much not true, because what's happening is that different parts of the brain have different jobs and do different things. So for example, you have the right brain and the left brain, and then within that you have more complex centers of the brain, such as the hippocampi and the prefrontal cortex and the occipital lobe and the parietal lobes. And all these things do very specific things, such as translate what you're seeing through your eyes, or take in sensory inputs so that you can better understand your environment and put a picture together. So when you're growing up and you're younger, your brain is making connections between all these different areas and trying to understand what is going on in the world. And as your brain is learning about the world, it's developing all these different pathways. So here's a poor illustration of the brain. And we're going to have a little almond-like shape in the center. So we have all these different pathways called axons being developed in the brain. And these pathways are what allow for the different areas of the brain to communicate. So the growing process of an axon is as such. You begin to develop the cells known as glial cells that make up the pathways of the brain and make up these axons. As we begin to hit puberty, the pathways also have what's known as a myelin sheath. This is the white matter in the brain. So you might hear people talking about, if you're into any sort of neuroscience or science revolving the brain, you might hear about white matter versus gray matter. The white matter are glial cells that, oligodendrites, that cover the sheaths of the axons. It's called a myelin sheath. So it's an insulating coating that comes over the axon. As we hit puberty, the brain and this stage of maturity will remove any underdeveloped axons. So once you hit a certain age and you begin to mature physically, biologically, if you have certain axons that have not been fully developed, the brain will eliminate them. So why this is interesting is because handwriting is such an instrumental part in developing all of these axons. When we handwrite, there are so many different areas of the brain that are engaging with one another, and it's a literal brain workout when you learn to handwrite. And so I was reading an article that was done in Germany. It was a study done in Germany where they were looking at the comparison between a person who was writing quickly closed loop forms and slowly open loop forms and vice versa. So cursive, I don't know what I'm writing to be honest here, cursive loop forms and open loop forms such as printing. And what they did was they compared using a positron emission topographic scanner, otherwise known as a PET scanner. They used a PET scanner to observe the activity in the person's brain going through a series of different exercises. So one was they should write slowly the cursive loop form. Another was they should write quickly the cursive loop form. Another was they should write slowly the open loop form and then write quickly the open loop form. And what they found was that the fastest writing in the closed loop form initiated the greatest amount of activity all over the brain. And so they concluded that in their study that handwriting, and specifically the closed loop handwriting, is not an exercise that develops a single region of the brain. It is something that develops the communication between different regions of the brain. So handwriting is not just about communicating with the rest of the world. Handwriting is about communicating within yourself. It's about understanding movement. And why is movement important? What does movement have to do with intelligence? Well, in college, I did a really interesting study on a man named Howard Gardner. Has anyone ever heard of Howard Gardner? Howard Gardner is a Harvard professor. And he is renowned for his theory on multiple intelligences. Now, the multiple intelligences theory states that human beings are not boxed into a single rationale or a single type of academic intelligence, that our intelligence far exceeds that. So the idea behind the multiple intelligence theory, we can go ahead and write that, multiple intelligence. Intelligence theory is that human beings have multiple ways of understanding the world. And in college, in my art education, I was most interested in his theories because he opened the playing field to understanding how physical intelligence, how movement is actually a very significant part of understanding movement. And so there are different types of intelligences. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but one is audio. So some people are extremely intelligent when it comes to understanding and deciphering audio. Some people are extremely intelligent when it comes to visual decipherings. This could go with pattern recognition as an example. And the same with audio. You're more adept at noticing patterns, noticing differences. One is kinesthetic, and this is the one that I'm most interested in. Now, kinesthetic intelligence falls into things such as playing sports, the coordination involved in playing sports, the coordination involved in handwriting. And the reason I think handwriting is so important is that handwriting is the one physically coordinated task that combines both this kinesthetic intelligence with logic and cognitive thinking and rationale and abstraction, because language is an abstract thing. So, and abstraction. So because handwriting can also, because handwriting takes in both kinesthetic and logical / rationale / abstract thinking, it taps into more areas of the brain than any other exercise there is. So they've done PET scans, the positron emission topographic scans, which essentially monitor where glucose is being consumed in the brain. So it is monitoring the use of glucose in the brain. And what they have found is that when you are preparing to handwrite, kinesthetic, not kinesthetic. When you are preparing to handwrite, the brain lights up like the 4th of July. You haven't even written anything yet. This is called gestural preparation. And what happens is the brain, in anticipation of writing, is firing something called action potential. And action potential consists of neurological chemicals being fired into different areas of the brain and throughout the nervous system. And you have to understand too that the brain and the nervous system, we have the central nervous system, and then we have the peripheral nervous system. So the brain is really included in all of that. So as human beings, we are more akin to a set of wires inside of the bodies that we house. We're not so much the bodies as we are the operators of the bodies. And so we are the brain and the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, which goes out into the extremities, and all of the action takes place here and then follows through the rest of the body. So intelligence is not just something housed in the brain, but it's something housed throughout the entire body. So we have action potential taking place in just the anticipation of writing. Now, as a young person, it is really important that you embrace some type of handwriting, regardless of the style, regardless of the culture you're a part of. Handwrite and express yourself and learn to express yourself and build proficiency in handwriting as a young person, because this is the really interesting thing that I've read today, is that they have found with younger children who have ADHD or ADD, I don't know if you've heard of these, not ABAD and ADHD. I'm not sure if you've heard of these diagnoses, but they have found that children who have ADHD and ADD have so because the brain is smaller. So what happens is, like I said earlier, when you hit puberty and your axons haven't reached full maturity, the brain will get rid of them. So all of these potential connections that could have been developed in your youth have been removed. And you have to start that process over again. So what is interesting is that they have found that these children who have ADD and ADHD, and this is a correlation that I've made on my own and just speculation at this point, but these children have smaller brains. And they're not just smaller, they're lacking connectivity between areas of the brain compared to somebody who does not have the diagnosis of ADD or ADHD. And what's worse? What is worse than this? What's worse is the treatment for this. Worse is the treatment because what they do is they give these kids stimulants such as Ritalin. They give these kids Adderall. What do these drugs do? These drugs create a replacement for the focus. The focus drug is dopamine. Dopamine is produced in the substantia nigra pars compacta. Substantia nigra pars compacta. And dopamine is released in highly focused tasks. So if you are handwriting, you are releasing dopamine from the basal ganglia, and it is being received and fired through synapses. So they give these kids Ritalin and Adderall, which replaces dopamine, latches on to the same bindings as dopamine. And so this is why it's worse, because when the body sees that it doesn't need to produce something, it won't. And so these kids become dependent on drugs like Ritalin and Adderall in order to focus. I know this because when I was a college student, before I decided to take an interest in my own life, I had abuse problems, substance abuse problems. And Adderall was one of the drugs that I took for fun. So what happened was, when I decided I didn't want to do that anymore, and I decided that I didn't want to be involved in these substances anymore and that I wanted to do good in school, I couldn't. I couldn't even focus in class because the receptors didn't have their Adderall. And my body wasn't producing dopamine because I had the Adderall. So I couldn't do good even if I wanted to. I wanted to do good, but I couldn't. So what I found was handwriting, and thanks to the grace of my coach, Michael Lavery, handwriting revitalized my substantia nigra pars compacta and actually allowed me to produce dopamine once again so that I could focus in class. I could focus and do well in class. And the results are tremendous. One of these days I'm going to pull up my reports in school, and you will see that I went from failing, literally getting less than a 0.1 or 1.0 in GPA. I think I had gotten a 0.9 GPA, failing 0.9 GPA, to 3 years, just 3, not so many, 3 years of straight A's. So how long did it take? How long did I have to handwrite before I could experience the type of results that gave me the focus to do well in school once again? It took 30 days. And an additional 60. So total, I would say that it took a total of 90 days, because it was 90 days that I had off before I returned to school. So 90 days of penmanship transformed my brain. And I know this because I could feel it. I could feel it. I could see it in my mood. I could see it in my ability to pay attention. And this was something that was most profound. A lot of us don't consider our attention and what a good attention span means. I think this is a really dangerous time for young people to be growing up, because currently the standard is to jump from different points of reference rather often. And I'm guilty of this. I think anyone who is living in the modern first world is not subject to some genuine hardship because of where they're living is subject to this. Anyone who has access to technology regularly is subject to this, because what I'm talking about is the screen. The screen is the most dangerous thing. We have ever invented as a race. And it's because of the nature of the screen. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard of this acronym, FPS. If you know what it means, go ahead, toss it in the chat. What does FPS mean? But this This acronym right here is the reason why so many of us have a poor attention span. And the attention span I'm referring to is the kind of attention span we have in class, the kind that you have in conversation with people, the type of attention span that you could consider analog. The type of attention span you have for reading a book, or the type of attention span you have for making a work of art. FPS stands for frames per second. So the way televisions work. So the screen works because it has an image, and that image is blinking, and then it's coming back. And the reason we see movement is because here is Bob, and Bob is going to walk now. And so between every motion of him moving, we have a blinking image. And so our eyes love this. This creates a dopamine hit in the brain. And this is no different. Well, let's get into something. So our eyes love this because it is new information in an incredibly fast amount of time. So the brain is highly stimulated by the screen because it is flashing new information in front of it at such a rate that is so fast that it's addicting for the brain, because this type of high level of stimulation releases dopamine. So the screen releases dopamine inside of our brains because of the high refresh rate of the screens. And this is just how animation works in general. You need the flickering of the screen, and if you take a camera to your screen, you can see the bars passing through. And this is because the camera is either not in line with the frame rate or is capturing a higher frame rate than the screen is outputting. So you can see the lines on the screen because of that. Where our eyes, they don't make that differentiation. So the blinking of the image on the screen is a high level stimulant for the brain, and this releases dopamine. And it also puts the brain into what is called an alpha wave. An alpha wave is a relaxed state of being. It has been said that people who meditate find themselves in an alpha wave. So is anyone familiar with meditation? If you're familiar with meditation, just show me in the chat. Say something in the chat that you're familiar with the idea of meditation. So the alpha wave is associated with meditation, but it's also associated with watching television. In contrast to the alpha wave, we have something, or a state of being, known as the beta wave. Excuse me, I'm going to go ahead and mute my phone. Sorry about that. The beta wave is considered an active wave. So this is a wave that's present when we are doing any sort of high level of mental activity. So penmanship would be something that stimulates a beta wave. So these are both indicative of stress in the body. Alpha wave is often referred to as a passive stress. And the beta wave is considered an active stress. Now, if you're familiar with meditation, apparently no one here is familiar with meditation, but if you are, you tend to be highly influenced during your meditations. And this is something that you are doing yourself. You're understanding yourself better. You're understanding your goals better. You're understanding what you should do in order to be a better person, or in order to live a more happy life. Or you're finding peace in what is, and you're just allowing everything to be around you. And these are great things to experience through meditation. It's something that allows you to be calm in the moment and allows you to be joyful about what it is that you've been given and not feel as if you are lacking, to feel full. This is an important thing and an important state that we should all have, that the water glass is full and that we are full. So this is a great thing to be had through meditation. And it's really through the alpha wave, because we are highly impressionable during our passive states of mind. So television puts you into an alpha wave. This is really important to understand, because then you will see why the kids want to be like the heroes on television, or why they find such deep attachment to these characters they see in television. There's nothing inherently wrong with what's being put on television, but you have to understand that the U.S. military has used television because of its hypnotic qualities. They are 100% aware of what television does to the mind. And it's just television as a tool. It's just the fact that this blinking screen in front of the eyes of a human being puts them in this alternate state, this alpha wave, this relaxed, impressionable state. And so television can be dangerous. But the other thing that's important to note is that while we are in this alpha state, many of the functions within the brain are shutting down in order to conserve energy. So this allows for glucose to be built up. Glucose, if you don't know what glucose is sugar. And glucose is used as a source of energy. However, when you are in an alpha state, your body sees it as a passive state of mind. And so instead of using the glucose, it saves it. It holds on to the glucose because it doesn't know, or it doesn't feel as if it is necessary to consume. So glucose, when left stagnant inside the body, what happens when glucose stays inside the body? Glucose turns into glucocorticoids, otherwise known as cortisol. Glucocorticoids is what sugar turns into, and glucocorticoids are also known as cortisol. And if you're familiar at all with the health realm, people talk about cortisol being the stress hormone. Stress hormone. You may have heard this before. Cortisol is known as the stress hormone. So cortisol is actually a downturn of glucose. Cortisol is unused glucose. And why do we have unused glucose? Why aren't we using up all of our energy throughout the day? Well, one reason could be that we eat too much as a Western society. 3 meals a day is probably not the best way to consume food. But I'm no health expert. So that could be one reason why we have too much glucose. But I think it's because we have way too much alpha wave. We have way too much passive stress in our life. And that could be a result of television. So how do we combat this? How do we combat too much glucose in the body? How do we combat too much alpha wave? How did I combat? I did it through penmanship. I ate up all my glucose in the brain through penmanship. It's also important to note that cortisol is an inflammatory substance. So when you have too much sugar in the brain, it will cause for the regions of the brain to inflammate and atrophy. That means degenerate at an accelerated rate, which is potentially why we have things like Alzheimer's or schizophrenia. But that's more of a neurological thing. And then we also have things such as Parkinson's disease, which I can't say definitively are associated with glucose, but there is some interplay there between an abundance of glucose in the brain, the inflammation caused from glucose, and the accelerated atrophy of regions of the brain such as the hippocampi and the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with memory and logical thinking or rational thinking. So I used penmanship, and I learned to write with both hands. So writing with both hands, as you already know, is not an easy task. I learned to write with both hands. And this was recommended to me back in 2011. I believe it was the winter of 2011. I came across an individual by the name of Michael J. Lavery. I told Michael about my problem in school, and he said that the reason I can't do well in school is because the brain is a muscle, and your muscle is weak. It's as if you're trying to run a marathon, but you have never ran a mile. And that made sense to me, because I had never focused or never realized that the ability to focus is a skill. The ability to think abstractly is a skill. That these are things that need to be practiced. And given my track record in school up until that point, I was not somebody who was very proficient at thinking or skill work, or schoolwork, I should say. I had no interest. No interest. So now, my interest was a result of desperation, because I was going to get kicked out of school for getting bad grades. And so that was my motivator. And so I followed his book rigorously for 3 months. I learned to write with both hands. I did memory exercises. I learned other highly coordinated exercises, such as bouncing a golf ball off a hammer. And what happened was, at the end of those 3 months, I went back to school and I didn't have to try anymore. My brain just did it. It just paid attention. That was the most amazing thing. It just paid attention. And so and I'm sure if you're an enthusiast for handwriting and you're here listening to me, I'm most likely preaching to the choir, so that you guys already understand the value that comes from penmanship. It's something that takes your complete focus. It is not something that you can do whimsically, especially if you want nice handwriting. If you want nice handwriting, you have to pay attention to your movement. You have to pay attention to the forms in front of you. If you are whimsical about that act, you'll make mistakes like this one. You see how I was in a fury of conversation, and next thing you know, you're making mistakes as you're handwriting, like here. So penmanship is something that forces you to slow down. It forces you to slow down. And this is really valuable in an age that is asking you to hurry up. And you can tell when you meet somebody who takes the time to handwrite. They speak differently. They give you their full attention. And they respond mindfully. This is why I love the penmanship community. Because when you talk to other people who are interested in developing their handwriting, most often they are these 3 things. They're mindful, they're attentive, and they're considerate. They've understood the value in the moment. And penmanship really teaches you to be in the moment. So over time, this action potential is the term that is used to describe the firing of neurotransmitters prior to the act of execution. Neurotransmitters begin to prepare all of the areas of the brain prior to execution. So you're considering a sentence that you would like to handwrite. And before you've even picked up the pen, the brain is preparing. And what's interesting about this is they've done studies to, this is an interesting study, that they did studies where they wanted to see, and I'm not sure what the goal of these studies were, but it was in the light of free will. And they were interested in whether or not humans actually had free will. Okay. And what they did was they hooked this person up to a PET scanner and told them that they were going to choose an answer 1 out of 4, or I think it was, they kept it simple. It was either to the right or to the left. I believe that's how it worked. And so they could see on the positron emission scanner their choice as it was made. It would indicate that this hand was going to move, or this hand was going to move. Excuse me. And what the participant or the person being studied was supposed to do was indicate which hand they chose the moment they chose it. And every single time, the study showed that the scientists behind the positron emission scanner knew which side he was going to choose before he could say it. So then that begged the question of whether or not that individual even had free will. Because the action potential is firing prior to the action. And it's firing at such a rate that it could be monitored prior to you even knowing or being able to articulate your choice. So me thinking about what I'm going to write next is sending neurotransmitters all throughout the brain and all throughout the peripheral nervous system and down into my hands. And that's another really interesting note on why handwriting is so valuable, because we are this brain and we have our nervous system. And let's talk also about this point right here. But we have our nervous system that goes down, the central nervous system goes down the spine, and then the peripheral nervous system goes out into all of our limbs and extremities and out and operates our body for us based on what we want up in here, supposedly, right? Let's also break up a little bit so you guys can kind of see. And I have an illustration to show you. But there is something known as the homunculus theory. And this word in particular actually arose because back in the day, somebody, I forget the scientist's name, but he was interested in the man within the man, the person within us who's actually controlling us, who would be us, the true us. So the true you and I is a little man inside of us. So the person, this word homunculus actually means the man inside the man. But now homunculus is used to refer to the theory of our relationship to our body. So our body has a relationship with the brain, and it's expressed through this central nervous system. And the brain, right here along the top side of our brain, so I'm going to give you a profile picture. This is our brain now. We have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe, and then here we have the cerebral cortex all along the top, which is the wrinkles that you see all along the top. Up here, along the top strip of our brain, we have something called the motor cortex. The motor cortex is a series of areas divided to controlling different parts of the body. 25% of this motor cortex, and it's actually, I think it might be in the front end that they decide, but for illustration purposes it doesn't matter. 25% of the motor cortex goes directly towards the functioning of our hands. 25%. So here's a quick illustration to show you what this might look like if we were built in proportion to the homunculus theory. So here's an illustration. This is from the Whole Brain Power book. Here's an illustration to demonstrate the allotment of resources in the motor cortex. Actually, this one is the sensory cortex. So if you've ever had a paper cut on your hands, you know how painful that paper cut can be. And this is why, is because we have hundreds of thousands, potentially hundreds of millions of nerve endings in our hands. And you can also see that the head is extremely large. So the head here also contains a large portion of real estate on the motor cortex, because in order to speak, it is a very complex action. Now this is the sensory cortex, or the sensory homunculus. So this is showing how the neurons related to sensory input and back to the parietal lobe are allotted. So painful paper cuts make sense on our hands now, and any sort of cut on the face is very painful as well. If you look at the motor homunculus, you can see that the hands are even larger now. So even more real estate in regards to motor control is allotted to the hands, and as well as to the mouth. And you can see specifically the mouth, because it takes a lot of coordination for us to actually speak. And there are all these different languages that utilize different parts of the vocal box and tongue in order to speak all these different complex languages. And so it makes sense. And then you can also see how the hands are extremely large, and we use them in tasks such as handwriting and calligraphy, but also we use them for a bunch of other really important and also highly coordinated tasks. And if we think back to our ancestors and how this was useful in a time where things weren't as automated, you can think of basket weaving or pottery, such as ceramics, and all these different tasks, weapon making, all of these different exercises that back then were essential for life. They were feasible because of the allotment of resources to our hands and the connection our hands had with our brain. So this is all leading me towards why you should handwrite and why we should handwrite, especially now in this 21st century. Sorry, I didn't write that on screen. 21st century. And it doesn't matter whether or not you do the cursive that I do, the business writing, or whether or not you write in your native language, or whatever it is. Simply moving the hand, even if it's through drawing or coloring or any sort of art form, all of this is extremely good for the hand and in turn for the brain. It's good for your body. I like to say often that I've been kept in good shape physically because I handwrite with both hands. And I honestly believe that's true. It's a workout, especially if you're writing with both hands. Handwriting is a workout. Back in 2011, around the time that I was doing poorly in school, I was starting to get fat because I decided I wasn't going to play soccer anymore. Now, I think it might be hard for most people to imagine a fat me because even then I was relatively skinny. But I could see the difference in my gut. My belly was beginning to expand. I was drinking a lot of beer around that time. And so I was getting fat. And then I encountered handwriting as an exercise and learning to handwrite with both hands. And within months' time, my gut was gone. I no longer had this gut that I was becoming self-conscious of. And furthermore, I actually got a six-pack again. So that was, and who isn't going to be happy about that, right? All I do is handwrite, and I'm aware of what I eat. I don't eat profusely throughout the day, and I'm in great shape. I'm in the type of shape that I'm proud of. I'm in the type of shape my girlfriend enjoys. I'm in the type of shape that allows me to run and do activities freely. And I attribute all of this to handwriting. So, that's why I think handwriting is important. And I just wanted to do this because I actually have work related to this up and coming. So if you aren't familiar with me, I taught handwriting, cursive handwriting, as part of my creative brain training program for approximately 3 years inside of prisons. And in that environment, I got to see how handwriting is indeed an exercise that can bring individuals immense amount of benefits in regards to their mental health, in regards to their mood and their state of mind throughout the day. And so in this environment that is highly stressful for these individuals, I had participants who were able to find peace and calm through handwriting, through ambidextrous handwriting, and also through other meditative techniques such as breath work and art making. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude there today. Thank you for listening. I hope you have found some of this valuable and insightful and entertaining in the least. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. And if you'd like to learn more about anything related to this, Whole Brain Power is a great book. This is not sponsored at all, but this is a great book that I learned from. And I've also written a book called Creative Brain Training that can be found in the description down below. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate your time, and I do not take it for granted. So I am very grateful. Now I'm looking for my mouse cursor because I can't actually stop the stream until I find that part. Oh, there it is. It's all the way over here, and my mouse does not want to work. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you so much again for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow morning bright and early. I will be here at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Take care, everyone. Bye.